On January 7th, 2021, the sun rose over Washington like any other winter morning. The snow was dirty, the sky was dull, and outside the U.S. Capitol, workers swept up shattered glass with numb red hands. The cameras had mostly gone home. The shouting was gone. But something else stayed behind. Inside the building, halls that usually echoed with tourist voices felt like a museum after closing. A staffer paused by a doorway where, just hours before, people had pounded and screamed. She checked the lock twice, then a third time. She would do that every day for months without really knowing why. Across the country, a man in a small town woke up, turned on the news and muttered, "They're lying again." To him, yesterday had not been an attack on democracy. It had been proof that the system hated people like him. He didn't trust what he saw on TV before. Now he trusted it even less. And maybe you watched it from your couch, feeling shock, rage, disbelief, or maybe a dangerous mix of anger and numbness. Whatever you called that day, riot, protest, insurrection, setup, one thing is true. You were never just watching them. You were watching us. What if January 6th wasn't the beginning of America's crisis? And not the end of it either. But the moment the cracks in the floor finally became impossible to ignore? Not the earthquake. The moment we realized the ground had been moving for a long time. Whether you think the people in that building were patriots, criminals, or pawns, this story is about the fault lines under your feet right now. The ones running through your town, your family, your group chats. Have you felt them? That tiny hesitation before you say what you really think at dinner? That small, tight feeling when you see someone's bumper sticker in traffic and instantly, silently decide who they are? If you have, then this video is about you. Because here's the uncomfortable question. Did America survive January 6th? Or did it quietly start becoming a different country afterward? Before you answer, take a second. If you're tired of 12-second clips that tell you who the heroes and villains are, if you actually want the long, messy story behind days like this, hit subscribe now so the algorithm knows you're not just here to rage scroll. Golden History USA is for people who'd rather understand power than just shout about it. All right, let's go back, not to the riot itself, but to the morning after, when the cameras moved on and the real aftershocks began. For the people inside that building, January 6th didn't end when the doors were secured. A police officer who had spent hours wedged in a doorway, crushed between bodies, now found that crowded elevators made his chest tighten. A young aide who hid in a dark office that day still jumps when someone knocks too loudly. A lawmaker's child now asks, every time a parent leaves for work, "Will you be safe today?" They don't make headlines anymore. Trauma almost never does. It just sits quietly in people's nervous systems, changing how they walk through the world. But it wasn't just the people in Washington who changed. Far away in living rooms and break rooms and kitchen tables, millions of Americans stared at the same images and drew completely different conclusions. For some it was simple, an attack on democracy, a line crossed that could never be normalized. If people could storm the Capitol once, what would stop them next time? For them, trust in the system didn't just wobble, it cracked. If they can breach that building, one woman told her friend, what exactly is safe anymore? For others, the meaning flipped. They already believed the election was rigged, the media corrupt, the elites sneering at them. To them, January 6th proved that anyone who challenged the system would be smeared and crushed. What they saw on their screens wasn't an attack on democracy. It was democracy defending itself from them. If you're honest, which reaction was closer to yours? Whichever instinct you felt, something important happened in those hours. Trust bled out of the room. Maybe you felt it in subtle ways. You used to assume that, sure, politics was messy, but elections basically worked. After 2020 to 2021, did that assumption feel as solid? Did you start double-checking everything you read, or stop checking anything at all because it was exhausting? Think about the institutions you trusted less after January 6th than before. Congress, the courts, the media, the police, all of them. None? Now multiply that feeling by millions of people all across the country, each pointing that distrust in slightly different directions. For a Capitol staffer, the fear was concrete. Will someone try this again? For a voter in a rural county, the fear was reversed. Will my side ever be allowed to win again? The details changed, but the sensation was the same. The floor no longer felt stable. And when people stop believing that the ground is solid, they don't just lose trust in politicians. They start losing trust in each other. Listen to how we talk now. Words like traitor, fascist, terrorist, communist, tyrant, enemy of the people, phrases that used to be reserved for extremists and dictators, now get thrown at neighbors, co-workers, distant cousins on Facebook. How many times have you seen someone post, "If you believe X, unfriend me now"? If you're honest, have you thought it yourself? January 6th didn't invent that language, but it poured gasoline on it. The event became a kind of Rorschach test. What you saw said as much about you as it did about reality. And once people started using it as a test, politics stopped being just about policy. It became a question of moral worth. For one person, the people inside the building were villains. For another, they were victims. For a third, they were stupid. For a fourth, heroic. But after that day, disagreeing about it didn't feel like a normal disagreement anymore. It felt like a verdict on whether the person across from you was even living in the same moral universe. Have you noticed that? Maybe there's someone you used to talk politics with, even if you didn't agree, and now you avoid the topic completely. Maybe you notice that when January 6th comes up, people in the room either go silent or suddenly get louder, like they have to shout over an invisible line. Here's the thing. Trust doesn't just evaporate on its own. It's pushed. It's shaped. It's pulled apart by something. If January 6th shook the floor, what widened the crack? To answer that, you have to step out of the Capitol and into a very different battlefield. The one glowing in your hand right now. Because the story of the aftermath isn't just broken glass and barricades. It's the story of millions of Americans, all staring at the same day through different screens, being fed different narrators, different villains, different heroes, until they weren't just arguing about what happened. They were living in completely different countries that just happened to share a flag. And that's where we're going next. Imagine two neighbors on the same street. They pay the same taxes. They drive on the same cracked roads. Their kids go to the same school. On January 6th, they sat down in front of different screens and watched the same footage. One saw a mob attacking the heart of the republic, trying to overturn an election with force. The other saw angry citizens, pushed too far, walking into a building that belonged to them, then painted as monsters by people who never listened to them anyway. Same frames, same day, two completely different countries. Which one is yours? It's easy to say, well, one is just wrong. It's harder to ask, how did our information lives become so split that we can't even agree on what our eyes saw? Look at your own habits for a second. Where do you get your news? One network, one podcast, one channel on YouTube, one Telegram feed? Do you scroll until you find something that sounds like what you already believe? Everybody says, I do my own research. But how often does your research actually change your mind? After January 6th, the information war didn't calm down. It went nuclear. One slice of the country saw looped images of windows smashed, officers crushed, gallows built, and heard the words insurrection, coup, democracy under attack. The story they were told was simple. This is what happens when lies and conspiracy theories are left unchecked. Another slice saw selective clips, footage of peaceful parts of the crowd, questions about why security failed, theories about planted agitators, unedited live streams by people on the ground. Their story was just as simple. This is what happens when people finally stand up and the regime tries to criminalize them. Which story did you meet first? Because once a story gets there first, everything else has to fight uphill. Social media didn't help. The algorithms didn't ask, what's true? They asked, what keeps this person staring at the screen? Outrage is sticky, fear is sticky, humiliation is sticky, so your feed learned very quickly what to show you more of. If you clicked on a video calling it an insurrection, you got more panels, more think pieces, more dire warnings about fascism. If you clicked on a video calling it a setup, you got more breakdowns, more proof, more warnings about tyranny. Soon you weren't getting news anymore. You were getting a personalized, curated reality. Have you ever noticed how certain phrases keep popping up around you? False flag, coup attempt, deep state, authoritarian takeover, patriots, domestic terrorists. The words are like uniforms. The moment someone puts them on, you know which team they're on. And once you're wearing your team's jersey, how open are you, really, to the possibility that your side got part of the story wrong? The more people argued online, the more the platforms rewarded the conflict. Viral tweets, explosive clips, threads, duets, stitches, watch me destroy this idiot videos. Each side watched the worst of the other side and told themselves, see, they're insane. They're dangerous. They're not like us. Ask yourself with brutal honesty, when you see a clip of the other side doing something outrageous, do you think, maybe that's cherry-picked, maybe it's not representative? Or do you lean back, feel that tiny rush of satisfaction, and think, I knew it? That feeling is the crack widening. Because what January 6th did, more than anything, was give everyone a permanent reference point to weaponize. It became a symbol you could bend into whatever shape you needed. Want to prove your opponents are fascists? Point to the footage. Want to prove your opponents are tyrants? Point to the prosecutions. Want to raise money, raise ratings, raise your profile? Attach yourself to that symbol. The battle over what really happened still hasn't ended. And as long as every camp has its own feeds, its own filters, its own trusted narrators, it won't. But those fractures don't just live in the cloud. They come home. Maybe you felt that too. At some point after January 6th, the arguments slipped out of the screen and into living rooms, group chats, prayer circles, break rooms. A brother posts that it was mostly peaceful. A sister replies with a photo of an officer being crushed and types, "What is wrong with you?" A grandfather says he's never seen such disrespect for the flag. His grandson sends him a long message about coups in other countries and says, "This is how it starts." A church small group splits, not over theology, but over whether it's Christian nationalism or patriotism. Think about one person in your life, just one, who became harder to talk to after the 2020 election in January 6th. Maybe you avoid certain topics now. Maybe you muted them. Maybe you haven't said out loud that this day sits like a landmine between you. Do you know what their feed shows them? Or have you quietly decided that you already know and you're done trying? In small towns, the cracks showed up at school board meetings and town halls. One parent stands up and invokes January 6th as a warning sign, proof that democracy is on life support and we need stronger guardrails. The next parent stands up and invokes it as evidence that the government and media will brand any dissent as extremism. In big cities, protests set against counter-protests, people shouting slogans about justice and freedom at each other, while police stand between them, staring into the middle distance like they've heard this all before. These are not faraway problems. This is the atmosphere your kids, your friends, your neighbors are breathing, and somewhere in that atmosphere are three quiet characters are still moving through their lives. The staffer in D.C. who flinches at loud bangs also scrolls through headlines that treat people who minimize January 6th as if they're personally dangerous. She feels less and less able to speak to relatives who insist it was no worse than other protests. To her, they are choosing delusion over empathy. The man in the small town sees coverage of long sentences and uses of the word insurrectionist and thinks, if I had gone, that would be me. His fear hardens into defiance. He starts talking about political prisoners. He avoids his coworker who called it a tantrum by sore losers. The father who stopped talking politics with his son notices that the silence has grown so thick that they now barely talk about anything that matters. Both are tired of feeling one wrong phrase away from a fight. Both are secretly afraid that the other might see them as a villain. How many relationships like that can a country absorb before something breaks? This is the quiet damage you don't see in the charts, the polls, the committee reports. When January 6th stopped being an event and became a test of identity, are you one of us or one of them? It slipped under the skin of American life. And while families were freezing each other out or walking on eggshells, something else was happening above their heads. The rules of the game were shifting. In legislatures, lawsuits, late-night negotiations, People were arguing over election laws, certification procedures, security measures. Every side claimed they were protecting democracy. Every side pointed at January 6th as Exhibit A. But down where you live, where trust either grows or dies, all of that sounds like noise unless you understand the deeper pattern. An event that should have been a hard lesson for everyone became another fault line, another dividing line, another tool. And the more we treat days like January 6th as weapons to use against each other, instead of warning lights on the dashboard of the whole system, the closer we move to a future where no side will accept losing, even when it's fair. That's the hinge we're standing on. Because the story doesn't stop with what we believe about the past. Now, it continues in what rules we're willing to live under in the future and what we're prepared to do when those rules no longer feel like they're ours. If a country reaches a point where no side is willing to lose, even when it loses fairly, what do you call that? Is it still a democracy or just a very elaborate competition for control of the scoreboard? After January 6th, that question stopped being theoretical. Look at what happened next. In state after state, lawmakers rushed to change election rules. Some tightened ID requirements, changed mail-in voting policies, reshaped who could count the votes and how. Depending on where you stood, these were either long overdue protections or thinly disguised attempts to tilt the field. One neighbor heard, "We're finally making our elections secure." Another heard, "We're making it harder for certain people to vote." Same law, two realities. At the same time, you had other people pushing in the opposite direction, calling for new protections, new safeguards, new reforms to make sure no one could ever pressure officials to overturn results again. Again, depending on your feed, these were either heroic defenders of democracy or power-hungry elites locking in their advantage. It's almost funny if you squint. Everyone shouting, "We're saving democracy," and pointing at each other as the real threat. But underneath the noise, something quieter was shifting. The baseline assumption that elections are basically legitimate started to erode. You can hear it in how people talk now. Both sides cheat. It's all rigged. They'll never let someone like him win again. They'll overturn it if they don't like the result. Have you said any of those yourself? Have you nodded along when someone else did? Because if enough people no longer believe that losing is real, that it's possible, painful, and yet still legitimate, then every election becomes one of two things: a victory or a crime scene. There's no normal loss anymore, just proof that the system worked for you or against you, and the rest of the world noticed. For decades, American politicians loved to talk about the country as a beacon of democracy, a model others should follow. On January 6th, those same politicians watched foreign news channels replay the footage with the same tone they once used for other nations in chaos. In some places, rivals smiled quietly. "See," they said, "they're not so different." In others, allies winced. If the United States can't keep its own house in order, what does that mean for us? But this isn't about America's reputation. Flags, reputations, reputational damage. That's for diplomats. This is about you, standing in a voting booth or looking at a ballot or deciding whether to even register next time with a simple, brutal question in your mind. Does this still count? If that question hardens into no for enough people on either side, the rules on paper don't matter as much as you think. Because at that point, the real Constitution lives inside people's heads, not in any museum case. So where does this go? Play it forward with me for a moment. One future looks like this. Every election night becomes a prelude to weeks of litigation, protests, threats against officials. Every close race is automatically assumed to be fraud by whoever lost. Every investigation is seen as persecution. Every acquittal is seen as proof the system is corrupt. Cable news and social media profit from the permanent fire. Activists on both sides fundraise off the panic. Politicians learn that their base will punish them more for conceding gracefully than for burning the rules down. In that world, January 6th isn't an exception. It's a rehearsal. No. Maybe not always with buildings breached and windows broken, but with something more insidious, the slow normalization of the idea that the only legitimate government is the one your side installs. That's one path. There is another, but it doesn't come with a triumphant soundtrack. In the slower, less cinematic future, the cracks don't magically disappear. There's no grand moment of national unity, no perfect speech that heals everything, no Hollywood ending. Instead, something smaller happens. People get tired, not just tired of the other side, but tired of being yanked around by their own. A staffer in DC decides to stay, but she also decides to stop treating everyone who disagrees with her as an enemy. She learns to say, I think you're wrong, but I don't think you're evil, and mean it. A man in a small town decides that if he's going to talk about rigged systems, he should at least understand how they actually work. He spends less time on rage clips and more time learning the boring mechanics of how votes are counted in his county. A father who hasn't spoken politics with his son since 2021 realizes that if they never talk about the hard stuff, someone else's feed will do that job for them. He reaches out, not to win an argument, but to ask a question. Can we at least try? These are not viral moments. Nobody makes TikToks about quiet decisions to engage honestly. There are no trending hashtags for I listened longer than I wanted to. But those are the tiny moves that keep a democracy from falling apart in slow motion. Because the real choice after January 6th isn't between civil war and everything's fine. It's between a future where the cracks keep widening until they swallow the floor and a future where people decide one by one that they're not going to live entirely inside someone else's script anymore. Which brings us back to you. All the way through this story, there has been one person watching who actually matters more than the people on the screen. You. You choose which feeds to trust. You choose which clips to share. You choose whether to treat people as lost causes or as risky, uncomfortable conversations worth having. You don't control Congress. You don't write the laws. You probably don't sit in rooms where reforms are hammered out. But you do control something that all of those people are desperate to control too. Your attention, your story, your willingness to believe that people who disagree with you are still part of your country. If you've stayed with this video to this point, it says something pretty rare about you. You're not just here for a hit of, my side is right. You're willing to stare at something ugly from more than one angle. You're willing to admit that January 6th was more than a headline, more than a meme, more than a date to throw at your opponents. You're willing to ask the one question most people avoid. What if the fault lines aren't just out there, but also running through me? If you want that part of you, the part that wants to understand, not just react, to get stronger, then don't leave it to chance. Make a deal with yourself. Make a deal with this channel. Hit subscribe to Golden History USA, not as a fan move, but as a signal. I want more of this. More context, more long form, less screaming. Turn on the notifications, not because some YouTuber said so, but because you know how fast the algorithm buries anything that doesn't fit neatly into outrage. Then do something bolder. Share this with one person who sees January 6th completely differently than you do. Not to own them, not to convert them, to say, look, this doesn't flatter either of us. Watch it and then let's talk. You might fight. You might disagree even more afterwards. You might also, for the first time in a long time, realize that the person on the other side of your argument is not just an avatar of everything wrong with the world. They're another human being standing on the same cracked ground, afraid of different things, told different stories, trying to make sense of a country that feels like it's coming apart in slow motion. And here's the last uncomfortable truth. There will be more days like January 6th. Different causes, different crowds, different buildings, different slogans. Left, right, and everything in between will find excuses to push the system to its limits. You can walk into that future as a loyal soldier for one narrative, ready to believe whatever your favorite voice tells you to believe. Or you can walk into it as someone who has seen the fault lines, who refuses to let any side fully own their fear, their anger, or their hope. That's the kind of person this channel is for. If you want to keep building that muscle, stay, subscribe. Comment with the one part of this story that hits you hardest, even if it made you angry. That's the point. That's where thinking starts. Because history isn't just something that happens on TV while you watch. It's something that happens in the quiet, invisible decisions millions of people make about what they believe, who they trust, and how far they're willing to go when they're told their country is on the line. January 6th showed us the cracks. What we do next decides whether they become the fault lines of a collapse or the scars of a country that somehow, against the odds, learned from what it saw in the mirror.